Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, he, she, stays in them. Welcome back to Misma Passion, YouTube's premier channel about all things women's football. Now, today was going to be a video about rating the home and potentially the away kits of the respective nations that are competing in the Women's World Cup later in July. I know how very creative, how very ingenious, how very unique of an idea for a video to make. However, there's been a lot of developments that have come up in recent weeks that I just felt needed to be talked about in a video, and as we are the premier channel of women's football here on YouTube, it would be remiss of me to not talk about these issues. Now, just to get straight into it, we have, as always, issues with money and payments. Now, to kickstart this issue, we have to start with the obvious elephant in the room, and that is the TV rights deals that were recently agreed upon by FIFA and the European Broadcasting Union. Now, whilst this story did have a happy ending in the sense that FIFA was able to strike a deal with some of the major European nations that had yet to strike a deal for the broadcasting rights of the Women's World Cup, this deal is a bit of an underhanded one in the sense that it was struck with the European Broadcasting Union, which I mentioned just now, which is basically just a collective of the biggest free broadcasting companies in Europe, like the BBC and ITV as well, if I'm not mistaken. So the issue is that this was struck by essentially a union and not the individual companies themselves, and as a result that means that less broadcasting revenue is going to be coming down to those teams who are competing at the World Cup, which does unfortunately hampers the progress and the developments that these women can make from a financial standpoint in terms of improving their facilities and their resources to grow the women's game in their respective countries. Now, whilst it's good that a deal was struck, there needs to be a lot of criticism held in FIFA's direction and in some of these countries' direction as well. Now, before I get to the criticisms here, I just want to preface this by saying that England does get a little bit of slack, a little bit of leeway, because they did manage to strike a deal with FIFA prior to FIFA striking a deal with the EBU through the BBC and ITV to broadcast the Women's World Cup matches in England. Now, it's good that that did happen. However, it is quite a shame that it took so long, essentially the 11th hour, for these deals to come through. And it's a little bit of an indictment on England because, after all, the Three Lionesses are currently the reigning and defending Euros champions, and it shouldn't have taken so long for such a deal to be struck, especially when there's so much hype and so much momentum currently behind the women's team of England. So hopefully this is just a lesson for the English broadcasters going forward, that they should not take so long to strike a deal. Now to the criticisms. So if you have been following the build up to the Women's World Cup, a lot of things have been going good and a lot of things have been going the way of some of the organizers and the players themselves, especially when it comes to ethical issues like the whole Visit Saudi sponsorship, which I have talked about to death on this channel. However, now we're gonna look at the TV rights issues here, and as much as I did mention that a deal was able to be struck by the EBU, I did also mention that this is likely going to be a less financially lucrative deal for the respective nations that are going to be participating at the World Cup, because this is pretty much a collective deal that FIFA has struck rather than individual deals, which are really good when it comes to financial payments and financial revenues for these teams that will be participating in the World Cup. Now, my main gripe when it comes to a general standpoint is that these countries have taken so long to essentially strike deals with FIFA over the Women's World Cup, and it's not an issue that they took so long, but it's a situation whereby they decided to bid less financially viable packages to the rights to display the Women's World Cup games on their respective networks, and that's a shame because essentially when you just turn the clocks back to Qatar, I'm pretty sure that all of these companies were falling over themselves just to get the best possible deals and packages to FIFA so that they can broadcast the Men's World Cup. Now, this is not to say that it has to be 50-50 immediately and whatnot. Yes, I do acknowledge that women's football does have quite a long way to go when it comes to the same kind of quality or appeal as the men's game does have, but you cannot argue with the facts that it has come leaps and bounds to the extent that it deserves a little bit more respect from these broadcasters. And it's respect in the sense that not only should they be looking to strike these deals as soon as possible, but they need to be willing to take these risks. Yes, I do understand that given the fact that the Women's World Cup is taking place in Australia and New Zealand, there's going to be time zone issues where in Europe they could be watching those games in the middle of the night. In America it could be like early morning, like 6 a.m. or whatever. I'm not too sure there, but it's a risk that these guys need to take because the women's game needs these kinds of risks to be taken so that they can advance to the next level of the natural evolution it's currently going through. Because I'm pretty sure if the tables were turned and it was the Men's World Cup that was taking place in Australia and New Zealand, these guys would have still fallen over themselves to pay the top dollar to broadcast these matches, and fans, whether it's the men's or the women's World Cups, they would still wake up regardless of the time to support their nation. That is a given because football is mainly about the fans and football is nothing without the fans. So that's just one facet of respect that the women's game needs to be shown by these types of broadcasters. And when it comes to these broadcasters falling over themselves to get the best possible package deal from FIFA to broadcast these games, this is the other aspect of respect that comes in here, in the sense that better deals need to be offered for the women's game. I don't know if some of the viewers here were watching this video. I'm pretty sure some of you have seen the news headlines and the articles that have talked about Italy and their bid for the Women's World Cup, and I have to say it's funny, but not in a haha way, but funny in a kind of way, in the sense that Italy were reportedly offering only 1% worth of the Men's World Cup bid to broadcast the Women's World Cup matches in their nation. And as much as that is pretty much conjecture and speculation because we don't have the actual figures, there is a lot of fact that is grounded in these accusations, and it's a crying shame because it's not like Italy's not in the Women's World Cup, because unlike the men, the women know how to qualify, first of all. Second of all, when you look at the Italian squad that is going to be participating at the Women's World Cup, pretty much every single one of those players plays for Italian clubs, the likes of Juventus, AC Milan, Internazionale. They are all being represented, except for one player who plays for Everton. I have forgotten her name, but I will look and I'll make sure I give her a shout out, because that would be very remiss of me to not actually do that. Now, it's a shame that when you're offering 1% of your men's bid for broadcasting the Women's World Cup, understandably, yes, men's games have more hype and the Men's World Cup has more hype compared to the Women's World Cup, but there has to be an element of national pride that must come into this here, because by offering such a pitiful amount of money, what are you saying to those women who have qualified and are going to play for the pride of their nation there in Australia and New Zealand? What are you saying to the clubs, or the female versions, or the female extensions of clubs, I'd rather say, of these players who are going to play? What are you telling those clubs by saying, oh, we're going to only offer 1%? What are you even saying to the young girls who are watching these games on the domestic level and want to watch these games when it comes to the Women's World Cup? You're essentially telling them that their ambition, their progress, and everything in between does not matter. And essentially, when you do that, you're pretty much killing the women's game in your country. And quite frankly, Italy needs to do a better job going forward of supporting the women's game, not only when it comes to these broadcasting deals, but in how they reflect. Because Italy, as we know, has a lot of issues, especially when it comes to racism and whatnot. We've seen those god-awful monkey campaigns, but here, this is just yet another issue that the Italian FA needs to deal with, and they need to put a lot more respect on their women's, especially with the national teams and going forward in general. And this is a criticism that's not only particularly leveled at Italy, even though it is pretty much about Italy, but also goes for other European nations that may not have the same level of respect or reverence for their women's teams. Like, a lot more effort needs to go in. However, I will commend some other nations like Croatia and other nations across the country, not across the country, but across the world, like the USA and Africa, who pretty much did fall over themselves to get these deals secured to broadcast the Women's World Cup. Other nations as well, like very obscure nations like Bulgaria and the Czech Republic and Denmark, they were quick to get the broadcasting rights secured, and massive credit to those countries and others across the world as well, who I have not mentioned, who did just as much of a stellar job in securing the broadcasting rights for the Women's World Cup for their respective nations. Top honors to all of you. And the criticism don't stop there, as FIFA needs to have their fair share and their fair slice of the sugar honey iced tea pie here, because unfortunately they were deciding to play Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde in this entire debacle when it came to the women's broadcasting rights here. And a lot of criticism was leveled at FIFA by leading journalists and speakers in the women's game, because whilst FIFA did try to look like the heroes by waiting for proper bids to come, especially with the likes of Italy, unfortunately they were the ones who have been the purveyors of this issue in the first place, as they're waiting and they're essentially demanding for bigger revenues and bigger packages and bigger deals for the broadcasting rights of the Women's World Cup. Was a two-pronged approach, in the sense that they were strong-arming these different networks to give the best possible deals for the women's game, and as we've already seen, some of them weren't willing at all to pay top dollar for the Women's World Cup here. And it's unfortunate, because whilst the intention may have seemed good, it was kind of sinister in the sense that FIFA do have their own version of Netflix for their World Cups and whatnot, which is FIFA TV Plus. And if these deals had not been able to go through, then undoubtedly FIFA would have used that platform of theirs to broadcast the Women's World Cup. And FIFA being FIFA, I'm pretty sure they would have charged us an arm and a leg to view all those games. But luckily, that's not the situation we find ourselves in. Now, given the extent of the finances involved in the Women's World Cup, a lot of the accusations and criticism leveled against FIFA are very valid, because FIFA have failed to recognize and to go along with the potential of the Women's World Cup and the women's game in general. Because as much as Infantino can come out and say, we want the best possible deals for the women, and we want to make sure that this World Cup has the best possible outcomes for the women in terms of not only financial revenue, but also growth and the improvement of facilities for at least the participants of the World Cup, their approach and their tactics to get to this point have been really poor. Because as much as FIFA did recently decide to separate the men's and the women's games financial packages in terms of revenue streams and player rewards and all that, it's come at the 11th hour, because a lot of criticisms and calls to separate that have been made way long ago in the past, and it's only now that FIFA are doing this. And these are some of the teething problems and growing pains that FIFA could have avoided should they have decided to listen to those calls that were being made a long time ago to separate the packages for the Men's World Cup and the Women's World Cup. However, it is a learning curve, and hopefully, even though this is a little bit of misplaced hope because it's FIFA, hopefully FIFA do actually acknowledge these issues and they do better going forward to actually grow the women's game, because it's really at a point where there are more eyes on it, there's more interest in it. People are starting to get behind their women's teams. Little girls around the world are starting to get more invested in the beautiful game because of these women. So hopefully FIFA do the right thing in supporting the growth that has been going on here, and hopefully these kinds of issues are one and done, and hopefully at the next World Cup coming out in, this is 2023, we're in 2027, hopefully it does not suffer from any of these problems. So fingers crossed. Now that this mini vent session is done, which is pretty much at 16 minutes of a rant, I did want to touch on some positives that have come out of all of these issues that have transpired in the last couple of weeks. And the first issue that I wanted to talk about was the good news that the women are going to be paid. And I'm not just saying that because it's the first time it's happening or whatever, but they're going to be paid fat stacks, as the kids would say. That's right, I'm down with the youth, guys. You can't beat me. Anyway, this is because FIFA has guaranteed that not only will their players be paid at the World Cup, just like in France, but the prize money for the players has increased from 30 million francs to 100 million in Australia and New Zealand this year. And that pretty much means that every player is going to be guaranteed at least 30,000 US dollars in their pocket when the tournament is said and done, with the winners of the World Cup, the individual winners, pocketing almost as much as 270,000. Now these are just rough estimates, but this is a lot of money for these individual players and for the women's game in general. And I believe that it is a watershed moment for these teams, in the sense that this is something that's going to help them in their personal lives, but it's also going to show that these women are not only deserving of better pay, which has been a topic of contention across the world, especially in the women's game for the past couple of years. Just look at Megan Rapinoe's efforts at that. But it also gives an incentive to domestic clubs to actually start paying their players better. And for some of the MVPs of those respective clubs, they do deserve to get those six-figure salaries, and some of them need to match the men's salaries as well. So that's a very good thing to come out of the whole financial issues that we've talked about in this video today. And the only issue arising from this whole payment situation that FIFA do find themselves in is that there isn't a very transparent method that's been announced. I mean, yes, you can just say they can be transferred to the players' bank accounts and whatnot, but the reality of the situation is some of those players may not have bank accounts. But FIFA are working with FIFPro, that is the Professional Football Players Union, to make sure that the money reaches these players some way, somehow. So that's good news for the women, that's good news for women's football, and that just makes everybody happy in general. And to wrap up what is potentially the longest video that I have on this channel to date, I wanted to give a special shout out to two players who will be at the World Cup. And first of all, that is going to be Christine Sinclair, who is an 8-time Canadian Women's Player of the Year and Canadian gold medal winner at the recent Olympics for football, of course. She is going to be one of the many veterans who is going to be participating at the Women's World Cup, and probably her last World Cup, but who knows. She has been going strong because she's currently 40 years old, and that is 40 years young because she's been playing since pretty much 1994, and that's a long time in the game. So hopefully she and the Canadian women's team have a very good tournament, and she's definitely one of the extra stories that you need to look out for when it comes to the Women's World Cup. And the other player who we're gonna give a shout out to is Caroline Seeger, who, make sure you're listening to this very carefully, is competing in her 5th consecutive Women's World Cup. Now, Seeger has almost like Sinclair here, been playing for a very long time, but she debuted in 1998, 4 years after Christine Sinclair, and Seeger has played at every major tournament since 2005, starting with the 2005 Euros all the way up to the World Cup this year. So she is pretty much a workhorse. She is a Terminator of sorts, if you will. And hopefully, just like Sinclair, she has a very good tournament with Sweden. And the best of luck to both of these players, as well as so many other different players and women who I have not mentioned, because there are a lot to talk about. But I will make an effort to make a video to just extend the World Cup stories to look out for, which is where I got these two shout outs from in the comment section. Thank you very much for watching that previous video. It has done an insane amount of views, which I have never expected to happen so quick in this channel's short lifespan. Thank you all for watching that. Thank you all for watching this video. Look out for the the kit ratings video, which is again very creative of me. And also look out for extra World Cup stories to look out for once the appropriate research has been done. Otherwise, until next time, thank you, goodbye, like, share, and subscribe.